Okay, hi everybody, good evening. First of all, thank you all for coming. Tonight we're going to be talking to Joey Garcia. For those of you who don't know, he's a partner at ISOLAS. This is a law firm that was set up in Gibraltar over 100 years ago. And he is in charge of the Fintech and Distributed Ledger Technology team there. He was recently recognized by Chambers and Partners as one of only 12 lawyers in the world, leading the blockchain and cryptocurrency space. He is pioneering in distributed ledger as a lawyer, hailed as a super practitioner by market sources. This is what they say about you. I know, this is what they say about you. So he recently advised Gnosis on its ICO, first time consensus project, which was run from Gibraltar, Zappo on achieving their e-money license, and also he's been deeply involved in sharing the regulatory environment in Gibraltar, co-chairing the government's working group. So, Joe, tell us a little bit about yourself after that intro. Tell us about where you started, university days, when you came back to Gibraltar.
Sure, I mean, I'm not sure how much interest there is in my beginnings or anything like that, but you know, the space is clearly something that is evolving at an unbelievable speed in multiple jurisdictions around the world. So if I talk about how I got involved or where the placing was in this particular space in Gibraltar, it is super interesting because we started to take a view, you know, as you know, about 4 years ago, in creating the right environment for certain operations to be able to run their businesses from Gibraltar. And, you know, why do we do that? I mean, you've got different approaches in different jurisdictions around the world. I suppose if you look at somewhere like the US, the approach there has been, well, let's just apply the old legacy rules that exist in the sort of money transmission universe to this brave new world. In the European Union, you've got some jurisdictions saying, well, we can try and squeeze it into payment services directive type interpretations or other relevant things that exist. And then in Gibraltar, we said, well, none of this is really appropriate. I mean, I used an example today, and I said, you know, anyone can call themselves a nutritionist, but not everyone can call themselves a dietitian. You need to be qualified in a certain way to get that type of thing. So we said, let's build a very specific environment for this specific area from the ground up, and let's see what the feedback is. And the feedback has been absolutely unbelievable, and it's placed, you know, it has placed Gibraltar in a very unique position. You know, we say it all the time, day to day. You know, there are groups from all over the world, well-established groups, and they might be running in whatever it is, London, and they simply cannot operate within a regulated environment, even though the standards are extremely high. So building the right framework for them is attracting those groups. And I'm using New York as a silly example, London as a silly example. It's the same with Tel Aviv. It is the same with New York, San Fran, you know, all over the world, and across Asia as well. So it's a great position to be in. And as you know, Gibraltar's been a little bit entrepreneurial in what it does. We've approached this area before, right? We did it in the gaming space. Online gaming regulation didn't exist anywhere. There was no way of that type of business being captured within a protective environment for consumers, let's say. And we created a regulatory framework. It didn't exist, but we set the standard there. And nowadays, most jurisdictions have their own different frameworks. But because we were the first to do it and we did it right, we attracted the largest businesses in the world to operate from little Gibraltar. And I think here the government kind of sees potentially a similar opportunity. If we get the thing right, we can attract the right people, we can set the standard here, and that's kind of where we've been going.
So just to take it back a bit, by the way, if anybody wants to ask any questions throughout, just shoot, because we're in a very comfortable space and I want everybody to be able to find out whatever it is that interests them. So going back a bit, you returned to Gibraltar to work as a lawyer.
Yeah.
and you were interested in fintech. So how did you develop your understanding of that technology and the legal aspects? Because obviously this was completely unknown at the time.
Yeah. I mean, we had, I suppose it was Zappo, who are, a call it Bitcoin custody or wallet provider, generally speaking, that many years ago were looking around the world for an e-money solution for certain fiat solutions that they wanted to build into the wallet, and they came out to Gibraltar about four and a bit years ago, and it was really them that started saying, the opportunity for building the right framework for this kind of business is phenomenal, and that was very much the trigger point for approaching the government and saying, this is something that we want to approach through a working group type mechanism to try to build out. And 4 years ago, if you said the word Bitcoin in public, people assume you're a criminal. And 4 years ago, if you called a meeting with a regulator, they could send their enforcement team or a police officer. That was the starting point. So, I came back to Gibraltar to work in all sorts of new and developing areas. In this particular area, just to answer your question, there were very clear opportunities which we've worked very, very hard to develop over a very, very long time. The legal issues there were less complex because you were looking to fit existing, let's just call it Bitcoin service providers, into an existing regulatory framework. The legal issues today, if you look at things like exchanges or the operation of exchanges within certain regulatory environments, is much, much more complex. And if you look at ICOs in particular, or token sale type activity, and you ask about legal issues, they're immensely complex, and they are evolving almost daily. I would say, if you talk about a project that you ran 3 months ago, it's almost like the good old days. It's another huge generation ago. So things are evolving at an unbelievable speed, as are all of the legal issues. We hear things from the SEC. We see in the US in particular, lots of interesting things evolving. The distinction between a pre and post functional type unit, the use of this SAF type pre-sale arrangement or agreement, the Howey test and the interpretation around that and what it means is evolving and changing all of the time. And some of the big US firms that are active in this space, I would say some of the biggest US firms, are moving direction of things, and the influence of that is that those guys and the SEC is trying to move other regulatory bodies and legal standards across with them. So that's definitely something that we're seeing a lot of as well. But at the same time, wonderful opportunities. There's some fascinating and brilliant groups that are working in the space, and also a lot of bad guys. So the risk levels can be astronomical. The opportunities, I think, are also astronomical, and the legal issues can be astronomical. People don't talk or focus that much on, when they talk about token sales or ICOs, people always focus on the positive. You'll never go to a Bitcoin conference and have a lawyer stand up and talk for half an hour about all the potential litigation issues. But you can go back to case law back as far as 2015, and if you want to look at some of the developments and some of the actions that have been taken by the CFTC or other groups, and even private action suits, Gigawatts, Tezos, all of these other things that are going on now, it's very, very real. And I think today, and my background is in financial services and in fund structuring and all of that sort of thing, we've seen this all before. If you missell a financial product and someone makes 1,000%, you're probably not going to have that much immediate litigation. Now, if he loses 95%, the first questions that the lawyer is going to ask him is, how was this product distributed to you? How do you become aware of it? How was it sold? Who sold it? What was? There's all sorts of things around that. So when you think about tokens, if you develop a white paper and you say, well, this is not a prospectus, and someone puts up $5 million based on all sorts of promises of deliveries of things and allocations and all of this wonderful stuff that can go in, and you then lose 90% of the value of that. You know, I think a lot of people are going to say, well, that might not be a prospectus, but it's created a reliance of delivery of certain things, and if you haven't delivered on those things, there's all sorts of other legal issues that can come out. And I don't want to focus too much on all the legal bits. But
well, I was going to say, and that's not a question that we've talked about, do you think it attracts more of the bad guys than any other space that has just emerged, say, 20 years ago? Because I know we talked about the fact that you think having a background in funds is essential to working into this industry, especially in the legal field, or to call yourself an expert, as many do.
Yeah.
And that is a question that I will ask for you to talk about a bit later. But one of the things that comes to mind is that it's an emerging industry. Do you think that it attracts more bad guys than any other?
Look, I mean, yes, I would probably say. I mean, I think, forget about the actual sale itself. Just look at the practitioners or advisors or anything. Look at the lawyers through to the advisors, consultants, all of these specialist groups that all of us will be seeing day to day on LinkedIn, etc. There are guys that might have been running a recruitment business really well 2 months ago, and today they are expert blockchain advisors and consultants developing entire frameworks of pushing things in a certain direction. There are lawyers and whatever that might have brilliant experience in whatever. I used a silly example before, conveyancing. They can be brilliant conveyancing lawyers. Should a conveyancing lawyer be running an advisory service in respect of a fund structure? Probably not, but they are involved in this space. And then if you look at the actual bad guys in the world, if you can say, I can raise $10 million instantly, on the basis of an idea, completely undiluted capital, immediate, unknown. A lot of bad guys are going to be attracted to this universe, and there is no mechanism that actually stops them from doing that. In some countries, there have been codes of practice, effectively self-regulatory type regimes, or just principles, and that's great for the really good guys. They're going to operate to that standard. If you're a really bad guy and you don't operate to any of those standards, or you completely ignore them, there's no power to act against them.
So it's because it's an unregulated space in most places that this is happening.
And I think, we talk about this a lot sort of privately when we speak to people. I mean, everyone generally knows about the distinction between, just call it a utility token or a security token, very, very, very high level. But different regulatory bodies have very different interpretation issues that exist around what the test is for a security. So I think a public immediate sale to the whole world to raise hundreds of millions of dollars without any legal analysis, and that has never happened in the history of time. And so, and that's not to say, by the way, I don't think that everything should automatically fall within a securities framework or anything like that. But there's definitely a lot of risk. If you go back 6 months or 9 months, a lot of these sales were being conducted without even any sort of AML, KYC or compliance framework in place. Maybe they weren't breaching any legal requirements, but maybe less people know that in some jurisdictions, like the UK, AML KYC fines in 2016 were around 20 million pounds. In 2017, there were 230 million pounds.
Wow.
So, that's 1,000% increase. A lot of this activity is coming onto the radars of a lot of the regulatory bodies, and maybe a lot of them aren't taking immediate action or pursuing things, and they're just accumulating information. But I think, unfortunately, some of the dangers are being accumulated. So
you incorporated a lot of the newer, very large companies. You've mentioned Sapo and Wences Casares, and I'd like you to tell the story a little bit about Wences Casares and the first e-money license in Gibraltar.
Yeah, I think that, Wences, for guys who are sort of in the blockchain space, You know, Zappa are very well known, and they offer some. I mean, if I think about the Bitcoin space in particular, what is the closest that you get to a banking infrastructure or framework? You know, I would put Zappa up there. You might put Coinbase up there, and maybe one other. But you know, in that universe of Bitcoin, someone like Wences is like a mini celebrity. I mean, he's very, very famous and well known. He is he's very well qualified in the space, and he's obviously one of the directors of PayPal, etc. as well. And he's a true entrepreneur and a true sort of long-term believer. He's definitely an incredibly smart and convincing guy. And you know, he did a lot of research around lots of different places. So you know, his touch point to Gib, in my own very selfish personal experience, was very material in the way that it moved things in a certain way, as was his engagement with the regulators, his engagement with governmental authorities, etc. And it's great that a name like Zappa that is so well known or respected in that space is one of the things that got things moving.
So you would say he was instrumental in making that wheel start to turn.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's good. So what effect do you think it's having on the local market today?
It's astronomical. It is astronomical. I think, you know, for the guys who don't know that well, we have worked on. So if you think of, I mean, the token universe is something that sits on sort of, you know, batch A and batch B, the regulation of certain businesses that operate in the space, and we've developed this concept of a storage or transfer of value mechanism. They want to operate within a regulated type environment. That law came into effect on the 1st of January, right? So if I talk about the movement or what the effect is on the local community, you know, some of the biggest providers of services in this world, including the exchange, etc., are going for these licenses. The numbers are astronomical. So in Gibraltar, where, you know, I don't know, 5 insurance companies have made an application in 3 months, that would be incredibly, you know, odd and sort of moving. And in this space, it's been tens and tens of very large and well-known groups. So that is immediately going to have a very material impact. Also, people conducting these token sale type activities are looking to build out regulated pieces on the services that they offer. They would do it maybe anywhere, but they're being put into the only environment that's going to recognise and regulate that activity. And the way that we're regulating it, if you think of like one extreme being like the bit license, the New York bit license on one extreme, you know, hundreds of pages of very detailed and codified rules, etc., etc. You know, that was written in such a way that it could, when it kind of did become, it can become obsolete in weeks.
Yeah.
So the way that we've approached it is to just, you know, take basic principles that need to be applied to any well-run financial services business or any business.
Okay.
And we've defined the principles, and then these detailed guidelines that can continue to evolve, and that is very, very attractive to these groups because they say, well, we to become regulated, we need to operate to these principle standards, and this is a way to do that. And it's, you know, it's definitely, I think it's a material effect to the direction that Gibraltar is going to place itself in the world. That doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of risk, etc. All of that stuff comes with it as well. But I think the opportunities are definitely
the regulation will also have to evolve to keep up, because technology is ever changing, and what we know as blockchain today might be but then yes, you're right, but at the same time, and if you've got let's just talk a very basic principle relating to, I don't know, corporate governance. Okay. That will always have to be there. So the way that needs to be interjected to a decentralized platform versus a wallet provider versus, all of that will always continue to evolve, or ideas that we haven't even thought about yet. Yeah. But the point that the way that we've tried to approach is to say, well, corporate governance is there. Now, how you interpret or how you comply with that can continue to evolve almost day to day if it needs to. Okay. But that, you know, but we will always have to comply with it. But the principle will always be, we use the term often, you know, risk-based,
and proportionate. So again, you have that flexibility to apply those rules in a certain way.
So how does Gibraltar compare to other jurisdictions, like, for example, Switzerland?
Yeah, it's a really interesting. I mean, I think, again, it's slightly different in different ways. Switzerland has this sort of SRO type, self-regulated organization type regime, and a lot of activity can, in certain circumstances, fall under that. It has a banking framework that's very well known and respected around the world, and they have talked about, adding to the banking framework a kind of, call it Fintech banking type license, but that has come across all sorts of opposition. I mean, it's difficult to move certain things, not in Switzerland specifically, but in any very large jurisdiction. You put the UK in the same bracket. So that they are doing a lot of really good stuff. They're reacting to problems that exist in the corporate services world, in the private banking universe. They're looking at this as a new, but they're good quality people. They've got no criticisms or anything in that sense. But there are also very strong oppositions from certain groups in Switzerland, and they have not built anything really that is brand new from the ground up for this area. That's in the basic sort of blockchain framework. In the ICO framework, or token generating events, as they're more commonly referred to there, that they have like certain types of structures, which the classic sort of non-profit foundation, Stiftung structure, started in Switzerland with the Ethereum Foundation, etc. And that worked very well for the Ethereum Foundation. In my mind, not every one of the businesses that we've talked about can operate within a non-profit foundation. So I use sometimes a drawing of a set of lemmings, and this is not exclusive to the crypto universe. Why do people set hedge funds up in the Cayman Islands? Sometimes it's brilliant. A lot of the times it's just because that was what the last 50 guys did, so let's just replicate and follow, even if it's not particularly speaking the right phrase. Let's just follow the foundation structure. I think of slightly in that way, everyone wanting to follow the Ethereum Foundation and what they did and replicate that, and that is very difficult. And I think things, unfortunately, like Tezos, etc., have created a lot of pressures, and one of the potential issues, and they are real issues, are around time frame. So going through a process involving FinCEN to approve the registration of a non-profit foundation in Switzerland, maybe that can happen a bit quicker. It can happen over 7, 8, 9 months as well, and that's a huge distinction, because from our point of view, the time frames are very much controlled by us. And what everyone wants to do, any jurisdiction, Switzerland, Singapore, anywhere in the world, everyone is looking for the same thing: legal certainty, regulatory certainty, tax certainty, banking support. And in Switzerland, I think the banking question is obviously a big issue for them at the moment. Yeah.
Anybody want to ask Joey anything at this point before we move into some other topics? Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Regarding banking, how's the banking now in Gibraltar? Are they loosening up, or what's the status?
Yeah, no, that's a reasonable question. I think, when we started this whole process, I mean, we all talk about this, call it just a generally blockchain solution, as a three-legged table. On one of the legs is banking. I mean, if you were to take that away completely, the table falls over every time, regardless of the leg that you're taking away. So there's been a lot of effort over time to talk about this, to if the right term is educate, but continuously bring people along. I mean, you've got an initiative that's been led by the government of Gibraltar, that's been supported by the regulator. So that brings with it a certain voice in the banking infrastructure that exists, but it's the Gibraltar banking infrastructure. If you are, I suppose, Société Générale or Credit Suisse, based in Gibraltar, you do not make policy decisions in Gibraltar. You make them in Paris or in Geneva. That's it. So, the answer to your question is, within the Gibraltar framework, and the Gibraltar banks, Turcom on the private banking side, the Gibraltar International Bank on the more retail side, there is very clear support, and there are very clear mechanisms for the way that they will approach these types of businesses and the way that they will support them. and most of the other international banks, it's very difficult because they are, even if there is support locally or an interest, it is very, very difficult. Now, I think there are big banks around the world that are spending a lot of time themselves investigating and looking and building things out, etc. But it's not going to. It's not a. I don't think that solution is going to appear overnight. But the important point from my selfish point of view is that there is a Gibraltar solution. If you can operate to the right standard, if you can have the right framework in place, etc., you can get the solution. And that sounds very. We take that for granted, but when you speak to a lot of people, they're amazed by that offering. So, but there are a lot of people getting the right accounts open. So that's a good thing.
I think if I may,
yeah, sure.
That when somebody wants to start an ISO, they're looking at different jurisdictions, and for them, obviously, it's important that they get the full package.
Yeah.
Not just regulation authority and anything, but banks as well. The more they support, the better.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting in the token sales space in particular. One of the big banking issues has been around the question of AML, KYC, anti-terrorist financing, all of that stuff. Now, and that's why typically now, if you're going to do a token-related sale in Gibraltar, you've got to convince the banks, even if it's not a legal requirement, and it might or might not be, but you've got to convince the banks that your standards and the way that you're operating those mechanisms from a compliance perspective are absolutely in line with their expectations. And if you don't do that, you will not get, there is no way that you will get, if you do a completely anonymous, wide, immediate public sale to, you can raise a lot of ether, you will not get that ether converted through an exchange and deposited in the bank account, in my experience. Yeah. Sorry, on.
I was just wondering, as a law firm, when an entrepreneur comes with ICO ideas, do you take some responsibility in terms of your due diligence and see whether there's substance here? Or
absolutely.
So you don't take on anything?
No. We definitely turn away more than 95% of the people that approach us, and we start with some basic questionnaire documents for a very basic initial assessment, and then we go behind that slightly as well. But we absolutely need to assess the groups in the space from a two-way point of view. Firstly, we need to be comfortable with them, but also we need to be sure that we can actually help them. And if someone says to me, I want to sell a token that securitizes an interest in my hedge fund, I'd say that's very interesting. You're effectively a fund. Now, the only way to do that is this, the mechanisms that you need to impose around that token, restriction, transferability, all of that is this. And they may say to me, well, but I'm a utility token. And I'll say, well, no, I really don't think that you are. And then we will part ways. Now, that's because they don't want to go down what I think is a correct route for that particular group. And some people in this space, they don't really care. They just want to incorporate an entity and say that they're doing something, and they're not really that concerned with illegal. So there's a lot of risk for us for being associated with groups that don't want to move things in the right way. And then there are lots of brilliant groups that are very, very good at the way they approach these things. So we're trying to...
On that note, I'm going to interrupt you again and say you've incorporated some of the most incredible startups, some like RSK, Concilium, Coindash, to Gibraltar. So what has been your experience with that so far?
It's been really good. I mean, maybe I'm speaking too narrowly or something. I mean, I think we're based in Gibraltar. We've got a brilliant startup out of Silicon Valley that wants to be involved in the space, and they choose Gibraltar as a relevant jurisdiction. I think that's absolutely amazing, and we do have a lot of traction with the right groups in Silicon Valley, in Tel Aviv, and lots of other key areas. There's some brilliant groups. I use silly examples. I mean, Syndicator, Russia, Bloom in San Fran. All of them are moving their operations, and there are lots of other large businesses that I can't really talk about at this stage. But it's amazing for Gibraltar is a relevant consideration for them, and I think we do offer a great solution. We are continuously comparing ourselves against lots of other jurisdictions.
So, how would you advise new entrepreneurs to begin the journey into the industry?
I would say be careful. Maybe that's. I think that I would be very encouraging at the same time, but there are a lot of basic risk factors in this space in particular that brilliant entrepreneurs are just not aware of, and okay. I would say take the time to really familiarize yourself and make a fully informed decision on all of those things. Take the time to build the right community of support around the project that you're developing. Take the time to consider the implications of distribution in all these different jurisdictions. Take the time to look at the developments that are happening in other places. There's a big trend at the moment in the space to move towards almost completely privatized or private sale or equity type arrangements during a pre-sale. You've got to follow those things. If you come with a great idea and in 10 days you want to launch a sale and you've got no backing and nothing, you have to be aware of the risks that you're taking on as well. So that's maybe a bit high level, but
so talking a little bit about Bitcoin. This was the first cryptocurrency, and it's been around since 2008, so about a decade now. Why do you think there is such an enormous growth of the interest and the value of Bitcoin today?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the concept of something cryptographic that exists with a sole purpose of being a storage of value mechanism, or whatever we want to call it, in 2009 was a pipe dream, I suppose you might say. If you look at the crashes and things that have happened in our established financial services universe over the last 10 years, I mean, it's very high level, but people have certain trust in certain government institutional organizations to hold certain value mechanisms and other information, that it's stored in a certain way, that it's treated in a certain way. People historically have had certain trust in a banking infrastructure, etc., that's existed for a particular purpose, it's held a certain value, performed in a certain way, and that trust has been affected and waned and put under pressure and cracked a few times. Okay. And people are maybe slightly moving away from that. From a very simple perspective in our point of view, other than the pure speculation factors that exist, etc., it's starting to serve a purpose that is more generally accepted. I mean, I joked
as an alternative.
Yeah, I've joked 4 years ago how you use the term and you interpret it in one way. That has quite dramatically changed. All of the bad stuff that happened in the Bitcoin universe, it's interesting to see how that has been pursued, and how the authorities have gone into detail in tracking spending and details of people who are related to that negative transaction, and actually arrested them. So the negatives that were perceived, this is a money laundering tool, in the reality of all the detailed reports that have existed from the top level down, is that it's not actually being used in those, and it's an extremely poor tool to be used in certain other, and that has become slightly more generally accepted. But there's been there's been a lot of things that have changed in the last 10 years, but generally this concept of a decentralized anything and the attraction of moving a value mechanism to something that I am not trusting a centralized authority for certain control mechanisms, that has happened along. And that's for us. I mean, if you're based in if I was Argentinian, my savings would have been effectively written to zero probably twice in my life.
Yeah.
If I was based in Zimbabwe, my parents' life savings probably wouldn't buy me a carton of milk. So internationally there are other different mechanisms that come into play. In some jurisdictions, in Indonesia or whatever, you can hold your base currency, And let's say you don't want that currency exposure risk and you want to hold US dollars just to preserve some value mechanism and you're more comfortable holding that, you can do that. It costs you about 35% of your savings to enter into that transaction. So again, things that are external value mechanisms, storage things, becomes very attractive for those types of things. If you're based in London and you're cleaning the streets and you want to send $150 to your family in Bangladesh and you want to do that through Western Union, it can cost you 7 to 12%. If you're using a decentralized mechanism for a value of storage transfer mechanism, it can be very interesting. So there are lots of things that are evolving, and I think will probably continue to.
So what's your perspective, your legal perspective of crypto tokens and ICOs?
Look, I think this is so quickly evolving. I mean, my perspective 6 months ago, 9 months ago would have been different, and different again, and different again. I mean, I think, the other day, I think it was the head of it was a Deutsche Bank chief investment officer, talked about an evolution and requiring, governance to build a regulatory framework, and he put a guesstimate out there of 5 to 10 years. Some countries, at a European Union level, there are lots of interesting developments, but I think it's going to take a long time for those things to evolve. So that's why I think that what we're doing in little Gibraltar, in approaching it in our way, is very interesting. It is very, very interesting, and it is quite unique in the space. So
we're seeing hundreds of conferences, consultants and experts appearing globally, I think, every month. So how would you define those who really add value?
That's another good question. I think, people who are looking for advisors in the space, there is a lot of value that the right kind of advisor can bring to the right kind of operation. The security arrangements, there are so many principles. I mean, something as basic as, fiduciary responsibilities that exist in a classic universe to all of your shareholders. To what extent does the group understand that for a token holder? Does that concept exist? There are lots of really good things that an advisor can add. On the negative side of things, a lot of the advisors are just really arrangers, financial arrangers in the transaction, just matching together, effectively, buyers and sellers through networks. They're not really advising. What they're doing is taking, huge commissions on money that they can arrange. They're not calling themselves brokers on that arrangement or anything. They're calling themselves advisors.
Yeah.
But they're not really providing anything to the project. So in a perfect world, although that can be valuable, no doubt, but in a perfect world, I would be looking, telling tokens to find the right group of people that can provide them the right level of support in the right areas. And finding funding is obviously important, but whether that should be happening through an advisor mechanism or not, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you've been instrumental with the government to introduce this DLT regulation. How does that fit with the concept of decentralization? Yeah,
that's another. So the way that we've thought about this is that a blockchain, and Bitcoin would be an example of that. That technology or that protocol that exists, we're not regulating that, right?
Okay.
So we are not touching. No one is proposing to try to regulate Bitcoin. But if you are using a particular network or infrastructure or protocol, and there is an intermediary sitting in there somewhere that's providing a critical service to you, let's say a storage service like a professional wallet provider, an exchange service, there can be many things. That person has to become responsible for what they're doing for you, and that is the group that we want to regulate. So it doesn't really, if you were a fully, properly decentralized piece of code that was operating to allow people to interact with each other, you wouldn't really be regulated. But if you were providing a key function in a particular transaction or something, then you absolutely would. And those are the types of people that we want to. I think we were talking earlier about Mt. Gox as a classic example type thing, but it was the largest Bitcoin exchange in the world. A lot of people lost a lot of money in that. It was ultimately two people running a gigantic exchange, and I can't remember, one of them got very ill or whatever it was, but that is the problem. Whilst if that type of entity had been run in an equivalent, properly run, controlled, with all of the right environments, then I think there would have been a lot of protective mechanisms in place, and that's what we're trying to focus on. Yeah.
So far, as you've been involved, what's been the evolution, and what do you predict will bring long-term value?
The evolution has been starting to try to raise the bar, trying to get the right people through the door, and trying to get the right legal and regulatory framework in place. Now that is in place, the challenge is getting the right people to apply.
Okay.
Getting really, we want to set the standard high, but again, it's not public knowledge yet, but when people start to hear the types of groups that are applying for these licenses and looking to establish those operations in Gibraltar, I think we will have done a good job. So at the moment, the initiative or the ambition is to set the level at the right standard, get the right people through the door, and continue to progress standards. I think yesterday, one of the Gibraltar Stock Exchange ran its token sale relating to its underlying subsidiary, the Gibraltar Blockchain Exchange, which is going to be a fully regulated utility token platform. Now, some people might say, I don't need a utility token platform, I just want to use decentralized networks, etc. Fine. But the point there is, again, trying to move things in a direction where you're building listing rules, you're building a sponsor regime, you're building all of these classic listing functions around this, and that is bringing in all of the protective mechanisms that exist in the classic world to this new and more risky blockchain universe. So that, again, is another, hopefully, a good step in the right direction.
So do you think there are benefits for entrepreneurs to start their businesses in Gibraltar?
Look, I do genuinely think that there are. A lot of the important things around it, I'm sure working here is the same thing. The right community of people that are brought together in a particular environment makes a big difference.
Yeah.
Getting the right exchanges, the right wallet providers, the right everything in the right place is going to create a lot of flow through. I think I mentioned it before, but certainty. If you're an entrepreneurial operation starting in Brussels or Paris or wherever it is, you want absolute certainty. You want absolute legal certainty, regulatory, tax. All of these things are absolutely important. In the old universe of financial services, that was a standard, absolutely standard process. In this universe, even the people that want that can't always get it.
Yeah.
So I think we're able to give that to them, and that's hopefully part of the attraction.
So to kind of put this all together, what's your advice for anybody looking to do business and for the future in the space?
I've got business cards.
Contact me. That's my advice.
No. Look, I would really. I think I mentioned it before. Just realistically, think about the real issues and give them sufficient thought, and just be careful. Unfortunately, in this world, in this new world, the bad stuff has not fully, the litigation universe that is going to exist has not fully progressed. The more time that people spend considering those facts, I think the better the position that they're going to be in. So take the right time, build the right support, take the right direction, involve the right groups of people around you, and take advantage of a brilliant opportunity. If it's done in the right way, even more brilliant.
Any more questions for Joey? We're going to be here for a while we have some drinks and stuff. Do you want to ask Joey a question?
Yeah,
sure.
Steve Berry, I'm a founder of a London-based tech startup. My experience in tech is that regulation can stifle innovation. And you're talking about creating a safe environment, regulated, controlled environment. I just want to know your thoughts on that. Whereas this regulation could potentially stifle innovation. And secondly, such that tech is moving so fast and innovation is the lifeblood of tech right now. How does regulation keep up with that? How does it keep pace with that?
That's a really valid point as well. I mean, I think regulation can definitely stifle innovation. Regulation can also validate innovation. So it's a two-edged sword. I mean, I think the wrong type of regulation, if we were to place every business into a banking infrastructure or an e-money or payment services infrastructure, all of these legacy, MiFID Universe or MiFID 2, MTF rules, etc. That is almost impossible for a business in this area to comply with. It is almost impossible, and that is massively, massively stifling. I think that creating the right environment can be very rewarding, because ultimately, if you're consumer facing, particularly retail consumer facing, ultimately that retail consumer in this brave new world is evolving. We want to involve the whole universe in it. What is going to give them that brief sort of comfort factor around knowing that they're dealing with the right group of people? The reality is that even go years back in the Bitcoin universe, everyone was anti-everything or anti-regulation, absolutely. But when Bitstamp gets a license in Luxembourg, what happens? There's a big price jump. There's a massive movement towards that market, even from the dark underlying Bitcoin universe, a massive movement to try to. So I kind of think, obviously there are lots of difficulties along going with this, but I kind of thought that the right level, the right appropriate level of specifically built out regimes for this specific universe should not be a restrictive factor. It should be a validating factor. That's the target. That is definitely the target. And well, that's kind of what we are focusing on. And I think one of the key points is bringing in, to a regulator, the right people. So, I think if you go to the SEC or the FCA or the MAS or FINMA or BaFin or anyone, you will find brilliant blockchain experts. There is a good chance they may have never ever met someone from the authorizations team. So when you deal with a process for applying for a license, they just don't understand. And I think the way that we've tried to approach that is to bring in really, really good experts specifically into this area, and above them another panel of experts that can advise on all of the things that are absolutely unique to this area. So we're trying to facilitate the right kinds of business or operating the right, and that is, and it's definitely a valid point and definitely a focus point, but that's the way we're sort of thinking about that. We'll try our best.
Anybody else?
Sure.
Regarding ICO, do you work with specific platform to do all the know your customer or whatever?
Yeah. I mean, there are. It's not a legal requirement that you use a particular platform, but there are very established groups. A good example of that would probably be, from my point of view, CoinFirm, because I know them very well, and I suppose in the Bitcoin universe, Elliptic and certain functionality that they can perform is very useful, but it doesn't really work on the Ethereum network. So CoinFirm is definitely the guys behind CoinFirm ran the compliance department of RBS for 10 years or something. So they understand the compliance and AML KYC universe, and they're able to front end and provide not only that solution but an ongoing transaction monitoring solution if necessary. And one of the things that we've done in Gibraltar is bring those processes to the banks. So making sure that the banks understand what can be provided with this new technology, and make those two things interact. So the bank, if you are running this particular check through CoinFirm as an example, then you are definitely ticking the box. CoinFirm, even if they don't identify the owner of an Ethereum wallet address, can run 300 or 400 risk metrics on that address and the ether on that address to produce a score. That is, if you're talking about a €500 transaction, that is an unbelievable amount of information that can be contained, and so I'd say CoinFirm are probably from my point of view top of the list. There are other groups. I think Bitcoin Suisse, famously of progressing, Yobit is another, I think, and then some people choose to internalize it all and do it all internally and build out those systems. Yeah. So.
Sorry, this is a stupid question, but observation that a lot of these ICO, the investors have this perception that perhaps they're buying equity here.
Yeah.
And to some extent, you know, a lot of the payout idea here is that you're going to burn coins. So it's kind of like buying some share back. So is that viewed then more as a security? Could you? But
Yeah.
it's interesting also, you look at companies that throw in blockchain into their company name and, you know, it goes up.
Yeah.
So could you take a company and just convert the shares into to some kind of an ICO?
There are different
And how should you be regulated?
Yeah, there are different rules. So if you were a listed entity with certain rules that apply to a listed equitable entity, and you wanted to issue, tokens relating to that business, there are lots of governance and even now restrictions that have been built very recently into US legislation, I think, to stop that from happening. There are there isn't a simple answer to this. There are lots of different mechanisms that are evolving all of the time. If your question is, can a company add blockchain to its name? Yes. Does it affect typically their share price? It does. What other expectations does that create? That's a completely different question. Mm-hmm. If it wanted to just randomly start to issue tokens, there are a lot of shareholders that would raise a lot of issues around that, because effectively it could be said to be a sort of dilution mechanism for their interest in that business.
But it would be an agreement to buy back the shareholders, right? So
to buy back the shareholders.
Yeah, so you set up you take your Spanish company, set up a company in Gibraltar.
Yeah.
Issue your ICO with the understanding to the shareholders, listen, now we're just going to expand our investor base, and it's going to be very efficient in terms of being reached. And we have
I mean, if you were to introduce a token that's main or prime functionalities was a buyback mechanism, you could enter into all sorts of existing regulatory provisions and rules that could apply to you. I think the more typical approach that I see is from driven by some large groups in different jurisdictions, moving or converting a token sale type mechanism into equity, on equity type mechanism, and the token feature just being a sort of bonus thing that sits above the equity, but moving classically into the typical equity financing route, and the whole bonus mechanism, the whole token mechanism just being a bonus structure that sits on the top of that. This is at the early stages to allow a company to build itself out, rather than doing public or pre-sale public type arrangements, privatizing that completely in an equity-like mechanism to allow the platform to be built, and then once it's actually built and functioning, only then doing a public sale. That is something that we're definitely seeing, and in the space generally, I think in the US in particular, there's a big swing towards the absolute privatization of these kinds of arrangements. So I don't know if that answers your question directly, but yeah.
Well, you will have more time, because you're not going anywhere. So first I want to say thank you to you. It's been refreshing talking to a real expert. I feel like you're one of the most knowledgeable people in this area, because you've lived it. And I hope you continue to live the dream, because you suddenly sound very passionate about this space.
I've got a lot to learn, like everyone else. We all do. It'll be a continued thing, but obviously a pleasure to be here as well and see you guys. Yeah.
So there's a couple more people. Margaret, my co-director, who you've probably all seen at the entrance. She is one of the people that has helped make this happen. So far, this is our 12th event. Next week, I'll be in Silicon Valley for a global event. And Abacus, who have been our sponsors for a few months, I just want to say thank you to them and thanks to their support. And Gibraltar Finance, who don't have anybody here today because they're in London working very hard, telling people about the work that they're doing. So again, thank you all for coming, and please have some more drinks, talk to each other, and hopefully do some business tonight. Thank you. Cool.